don't know me, I'm Dr. Robin Kyle, Director of the middle school. How many people here do not have middle school children? Nice. Okay, how many of those are lower school and upper school? Okay, so you got a little bit of a mix, just to know, but it relates to everybody. What we have noticed in the middle school a lot now is we're so passionate about everything our children, everything that they do. And when their feelings get hurt, or they don't do well on something in school, or they perceive that a teacher isn't speaking nicely to them, they immediately text you, and immediately it's a crisis. Or immediately they run home and say, oh my God, the teacher hated me, and she did this to me, and she told me this, and she embarrassed me in front of the class, and I hate it. And then we get the email, how dare the teacher do this? Because we're reactive, and we don't want our children to be hurt. And it seems that we're the parent generation that is really trying to protect our children. Whereas in my day, I don't know about your day, my mother would say, really? Go fix it. Deal with it. Or maybe would ask, okay, what did you do to cause that to happen? Now, a lot of times our children are right, their perception is right, but we're seeing this more and more. And as I sat with my team, I realized that this idea of resiliency, of a child being able to step back and say, okay, I've got to deal with this. Or if I run to my parent, that my parent can, that my mom or dad can step back, take the breath, and look at it from the outside to help the child learn what the skills are to go back and deal with that issue. If that issue continues over time, then it becomes a different problem. So I was speaking to Dr. Caproni, who we are blessed to have at university school. He is, let me get the credentials right so that I don't mess that part up. Dr. Peter Caproni is our NSU University School Consulting and Supervising Psychologist, and he's also the professor at the NSU College of Psychology for graduate students. He works with us at full time. What's that? Half time, although he's with us anytime we need him on call. We depend on him and his team of interns to really provide the mental health support that our children need. So we are absolutely blessed. So one day we were talking a few weeks ago, and I was giving him the update of the things that were concerning me that I was seeing in the middle school, and he started to talk about a presentation he had given a couple years ago. And he said, why don't I tweet that? And I said, that is exactly what we need to communicate. It applies to all age levels. It doesn't matter. So on that note, I am going to pass it over to Dr. Caproni, and I hope that everybody takes something away from this, and we can all work together to help our children make it through those middle school and other years. Thank you. Whatever you need. What? I guess.
Yeah, I go.
Sounds like thunder. All right, folks, I think I may, well, I guess I'll stay up here. I want to thank you for coming this morning, and I want to tell you a little bit about my background other than what you've already heard. My wife and I have raised 3 children who are now in their 20s, 22, 24, and 26. And some of the things that this book that I'm going to talk from, as well as a more recent article, this is the book, by the way, Drop the Worry Ball, and it was introduced to me by Adam Carswell, our lower school director, a couple of years back, and that was the original presentation that I had given. Since then, I came across an article by Brooks and Goldstein that talks more about why we must stop fixing our children, solving the parenting paradox, and that's going to be the first part of the presentation today. In between the two, I'm going to have 2 of my graduate students, Stephen Beard and Juliette Hubbard, talk to you for a few minutes also. They have some interesting stories from their perspective of being in their mid-20s now, and how things were back in the times when they were in maybe middle school and high school. Okay. All right. So thinking back to parenting our children, I thought about when things got started, things are brand new, you're very excited, you're sleep deprived, but you haven't really come across some of the more interesting challenges yet where we feel lost, confused, perplexed, disoriented, and I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I ever got out of that stage. I always kind of was challenged with something new when my kids would present them. We hope to get to a point where everything is fine and they're out of the house, and at this point 2 out of my 3 are out of the house, so I'm getting there. I used to have hair, by the way, before all this process. Okay, so what is the parenting paradox that we're talking about here? In the Brooks and Goldstein article, they introduce their talk with a fishing story that illustrates the core of the parenting paradox. And I'm going to have Stephen read this to you.
Good morning, everyone. So the story from the book starts as follows. From a distance, the lake and surrounding forests were an idyllic setting. Along the shore, a father was teaching his young son to fish. This appeared to be a wonderful teaching moment. Yet, as we approached, it became clear that the father was frustrated and the child was unhappy. You've got to hold the rod straight and cast straight ahead. I'm trying. How many times do I have to show you? I want to do it my way. You're going to break it. I don't care. What had begun as a father's well-intentioned effort to teach his child to fish digressed into an angry, unfulfilling experience for both father and child. This pattern begins innocently enough when our children are 2 or 3 years old. It starts with just a few words uttered by every well-meaning parent. Let daddy show you how to do it. Let mommy fix it for you.
Thank you, Stephen. That works better. Okay. So what they're getting across to us here is that we really don't want our kids to learn life's lessons without the mistakes and getting hurt that it really involves. And if we think back to our own days, as Dr. Kyle was saying, we probably grew up in a time when we had to fix more of our problems than we let our kids fix today. When we try to fix our kids' problems, sometimes, obviously all the time with the best of intentions, they often respond unappreciatively, and they don't want to learn the lesson that they have to helping is not fixing. And Brooks and Goldstein tell us that learning to support our children in ways that are truly helpful is part of the process of raising resilient youngsters. So what they do is they go through 4 very basic guidelines. All of this is stuff you guys know already and probably do most of the time. I'm going to tell you a story where I was able to follow these guidelines. I'm not going to tell you the many stories where I did not, but privately asked me to tell you my son's science project story, and that'll give you a really good idea as to one time I did not follow the guidelines. Okay. So the first guideline is let empathy be your guide. As we see in the corner, empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. And the next time I do this, I'm going to get much bigger handout so I can read it more easily. When your child struggles in school, say, I can see that you're having trouble with your schoolwork. Maybe we can figure out what would help make it easier, rather than try harder or put in more effort. Empathy becomes a starting point to locate areas of competence and success and to develop problem-solving skills, responsibility, compassion, and social conscience. I want to tell you a quick story of one of my daughters when she was in the 8th grade. She had a little group of friends, and one of the friends had a celebration. They were going to take a small group to Disney, I think it was, or maybe it was Halloween Horror Night, something along that line. At the last minute, my daughter got disinvited, and it turns out that there's some history. The mom was a teacher in the school that she'd had a couple years before. Their match wasn't so good, so my wife and I kind of had an emotional charge on this. What would be your impulse when something like that happens? Your kid comes home all upset. She was excited about going with this group. Suddenly, she's not. That's really unfair, right? It's really unjust. It's bad manners. You want to fix it for her. You see her in pain. What are you going to do? Well, as it turns out, we did the right thing, and we did nothing in terms of intervening. We listened, we tried to empathize, and tried to help our daughter get through that. There's an interesting end to the story. Our daughters went to the same high school. They had different friend groups, kind of stayed away from each other. But about halfway through college, the young lady in question had a personal kind of challenge, and my daughter reached out to her. And at that point, they became friends again. And now they're in the same graduate school, which is interesting. So empathy becomes a starting point, as we said before. Okay, guideline 2. Bite your tongue, watch, and listen. I have a difficult time with this. I don't know if any of you do, but I suspect you do too. Just as we observed our kids take their first steps without offering advice or criticism, we need to sit back and watch them experiment safely, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, and ultimately succeed. Often, or merely being present and supportive is the most helpful thing that we can do. Again, not fixing it, letting them experience whatever this adversity or difficulty is, learn from it, but we're sitting there, supporting them through it. Third guideline, understand before you respond. Sometimes our children don't want our help, and they perceive it as intrusive, and it perhaps suggests to them that we don't trust their abilities to solve the situation. How many times have you watched your kid start to tie a shoe or something similar and fumble with it and take a long time, and you're in a hurry and it's time to go? You want to fix it for them. Don't. Our message needs to be, if you need help, I'm here. Let me know if there's any way that I could be of help. All right, that's the third guideline. The fourth guideline is, compliment and be patient. Opportunities will present themselves. If we can help rather than fix, we're more likely to focus on offering realistic, positive feedback and encouragement. This is kind of more of an example from a lower school perspective. Your kid comes home with a problem in spelling, and she's managed to improve her test score from 60 to 80%. Do we focus on her effort and her improvement, or do we focus on her mistakes? And again, this is something that kind of is counterintuitive sometimes, because most of us grew up in a time when we had to try really hard. And that's the message we got is, try harder. Sometimes that's not the message that we need to give. Okay. So, what is the takeaway from this particular article? Learning is a process that takes time and practice. If we're patient, encouraging, and empathetic, we will have numerous chances to teach our children and to promote their confidence and their problem-solving skills. By using these 4 interrelated guidelines, we can minimize the parenting paradox and promote resilience. Okay, now I'm going to step back for a minute and let my students tell you a couple stories before we go to summarize the Drop the Worry Ball book. Who wants to?
Hello, everyone. Okay, so before I tell my own personal story, I'm going to tell you a little story about some lobsters. A lobster is a soft, mushy animal that lives inside of a rigid shell that does not expand. So how does a lobster grow? As the lobster grows, the shell becomes confining and uncomfortable, and it puts the lobster under a lot of pressure. So the lobster goes under a rock, sheds its shell, and grows a new one. Well, pretty soon that shell becomes too confining. So the cycle repeats. Lobster goes under a rock, sheds its shell, and grows a new one. But in every case, the stimulus for the lobster to grow is that it's uncomfortable. So I think we need to think about that when we go through times of stress and when our children go through times of stress. That stress can be a signal for us to grow and change. And if we use adversity well, we can grow through it. I have been homeschooled. I've been in private school and I've been in public school, and I can safely say there is no place where there is not adversity. When I was in high school, about 15 or 16, a couple of people decided they didn't like girls like me. I wasn't even really sure what that meant, but what it boiled down to was that they didn't want to sit with me at lunch anymore. They wanted to say some pretty nasty things about me to our shared friends, and they wanted to make the activities we were both involved in, drama, fittingly enough, they wanted to make that sort of uncomfortable. So I cried a lot. I wrote a lot of sad poetry in my journal, and most of it was horrible, but some of it I'll defend to this day. Perhaps I could have gone to my mother. She was a fierce defender in all things, but I didn't. Maybe subconsciously I realized that this was my opportunity to grow. What I consciously realized was that the solution to this problem was not hers to give. My problem was that I felt like my peers didn't like me. If my mother had come in and talked to administration, and administration had called the other girls in and made them be nice to me and made them sit with me, that wouldn't have solved my problem, because it wouldn't have made me feel like my peers liked me. It would have made me feel like they were now forced to be around me. Instead, I decided to try to solve this myself. This isn't to say that my mother and father didn't help me. The things they had taught me, not directly as solutions to this specific problem, but just in general, were a part of my toolbox that I now had to learn to apply myself. They told me the best revenge is living well. I didn't believe that until I had to live it on my own, but I tried. I went into school with that thought in my head. Be nice, be kind, don't give them anything to use against you, live well. If I had never encountered adversity, I might have never really understood what that meant. I might have just thought it was a fancy way of saying get revenge. But having to actively apply it was a powerful lesson, because by living well, I also gained the support of other peers, friends that I have to this day, and that was more meaningful to me than having someone else solve my problems. The conflict had motivated me to do better, to be better, and to manage disagreement, hurt feelings, or a fight with dignity. Without the conflict, learning those skills would have been like trying to learn how to swim with no water. I still find what I learned then useful, even in my adult life, where unfortunately there is still conflict. I'm not afraid of the waves now because I've become a pretty big lobster, and now I know how to swim.
So, some of you might be familiar with this conundrum that I find myself in oftentimes, is that when I'm speaking with my significant other, she's complaining about a long day at work, and the first thing I want to do is I want to try and fix it. And she comes back to me and she says, "Stephen, I don't want you to fix this, I just want you to listen to me." Is that familiar to anyone? Does anyone know that story with a significant other or a child? Yes. It's hard. It's hard. We want to help the people around us. And actually, the story that I want to share with you today has to do with when I was a child and when my parents perhaps got a little bit too involved in some issues that I was experiencing at school. So I was a student at a small private Catholic school, and it's about 25 kids in each class. So when you're only dealing with about 25 kids, if there are any issues of bullying or strife within the class, it becomes very noticeable very quickly. I was a pretty sensitive kid. I'm still a pretty sensitive guy, and that made me a pretty easy target. And I would come home a lot of days and just cry my eyes out, and I was having a really, really hard time getting along with these kids. So in about 7th grade, my parents, with every good intention, went and spoke to administration. And all of a sudden, our whole class got pulled together. All the boys in our class got pulled together, and the principal basically said, these are some of the names that are being thrown out in your class, and these are not okay to say. You know, we've heard about this. This is a problem. We don't want anyone saying that anymore. The problem was I was the only person in this group of like 12 guys who was being called any of those names. So it became very clear very quickly what was going on to my classmates, and it actually made the whole issue worse. I became even more of a target. I got bullied even more. And I actually got even more angry with my parents than I did with these other kids. And it was really difficult. This might have been something that, given time, given me figuring a way, giving me and myself a chance to figure things out, might have actually been better had my parents not done that. That's not to say that my parents didn't have every good intention in this effort. It just means that the way things went wasn't necessarily the best way it could have gone. And as a means by which to cope with that, I took one of the 2 or 3 kids who were lower than me on the totem pole in our class, and then I started bullying them, because that was the only way that I could figure out to not be the target. And that's a tough thing to admit to yourself, but that's sometimes what happens when because they don't know what else to do in that situation. Obviously, every school is different, every parent is different, every child is different, but for me, that's a reminder that I tell myself either with my girlfriend or with other friends, that sometimes, and maybe one day when I have kids, sometimes it is better to just listen and not to try and fix it.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Juliette. Any questions or comments at this point? Does this raise any thoughts for you guys in terms of the challenges you're facing?
So I think it was guideline number 4 that offer to help but don't be overly proactive with it. What happens when they try to take advantage of that? What happens when they ask for too much help and you want them to, for lack of a better word, touch the hot stove or do this thing that they have to learn? How do you create this?
What happens, hopefully, is that as a parent, we stay on message, that we continue to give the idea that, I don't know if it's best for me to jump in and fix this for you, but let's see if we can figure out some strategies. Let's see.
Dr. Caproni, can you repeat this question, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. What happens when you do the right thing, like Guideline 4 says? Your kid comes to you with a situation, and they say, oh no, I want you to fix it. Is that about right?
Something as easy as tying shoes. Like, I can't do this.
Something as easily as tying shoes. I can't do this. Do it for me, please. Okay. So my comment was, I think we need to stay on message that we're here not necessarily to fix things, but we're here to support you in finding a way to fix it. We're going to help you tie the shoe. Maybe we'll show you a trick to it, how we learned how to do it. But we're going to take the time and we're going to have the patience to let you go through some of this frustration on your own. Okay? Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. Any other thoughts or questions on any of these guidelines? Yes, sir. Okay, great question. The basic question here is what happens when your kid has a challenge in front of you, then you give them good advice on how to go about it, and they don't do it. And you know they're not going to do it. And you know that they're going to experience failure and consequences of something. Is that pretty accurate? Okay. Here I think, and actually I'll address this in a couple of the following slides, we're looking for manageable failure. We're looking for non-catastrophic failure. So if the question is driving drunk when I'm 16 years old, that's one that I can't afford to let the kid learn by experience. That's one I'm going to have to jump in on. But if it comes to something that's less severe, that the consequences are something like maybe getting a B instead of an A, or maybe even getting a C on a paper that I've left, too far, and done it at the last moment. That's something that we got to judge in each situation with each kid to let them experience that consequence. So, does that make sense? Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes, sir.
What would be a good strategy or approach when your child does fail and it's like meltdown mode afterwards? My son is a sore loser. My wife lets him win at everything, board games, whatever. I'm not that kind of guy. I like to let him lose. Not always, but he needs to understand that he's not always going to win, especially when at this age he's 5. And it's like, he loses and it's just like, on the floor, crying, and I try to explain to him with a level head. Sometimes you're going to win, sometimes you're going to lose. It's just how it is.
Exactly.
I don't know, is there a better approach? And it's not just that, but just other things. He tries, he doesn't put in a whole lot of effort, but he tries, if he doesn't get it right away, it's like, oh, I can't do this. What's the best approach to?
I think you're, okay, the question is 5 years old, doesn't like to lose, loses a game, and falls down on the floor and yells and screams.
Right.
Okay.
Cries and whines.
Cries and whines. I think you're doing the right thing in terms of giving him the opportunity to experience non-catastrophic failure and then to deal with it. Now, what you do from that point is you stick with him and you say, yeah, I know it hurts. You know what, let me tell you a story that happened to me when I was 5 years old. I had a half-brother that I thought was God, practically. He was about 22 years old, I was 5 years old. And one summer day up in Ohio, he's taking me out to get some ice cream. And I'm wearing short pants, and I'm eating my ice cream and not looking where I'm going, and I'm on a gravel path, and I fall. And my knees just get chopped up by the gravel, and I'm crying. And my brother Bob just kind of looked at me, wasn't too concerned, said, don't worry about it, Pete. It'll feel better when it stops hurting. I thought he was brilliant. Because at certain junctures in our development, 5 years old losing a game, 14 years old getting dumped for the first time, those hurts feel like they're never going to go away. And that's where our kid needs our expertise, to let them know that, yeah, I know it hurts really bad, but it won't continue to be that way. When it stops hurting, it will feel better. Yes?
But on a similar note, so what is the right way to process failure for you? Right? Because one thing is, yeah, it'll get better, that's fine.
Right.
How do you turn failure into a learning experience? Because I think that's the most valuable thing.
This is a great question. When you have allowed your kids to experience a non-catastrophic failure, how do you then process it and help them learn from it? Because that's the point of it. To figure out, yeah, I got to see, it doesn't make me happy. Maybe next time when I have that paper, I need to start a few days ahead of time instead of staying up till 2 in the morning and doing a poor job on it. So instead of coming at them as a sort of accusing or trying to guilt trip them, you kind of help them analyze the situation like we would on a job. How do we look at a failure and make sure it doesn't happen again? What can we learn from it? That's, I think, the approach that works. Does that address it?
Yeah. I think my learning has been, I told you so.
No, I told you so, then moves it into, then they're going to get pissed off. Exactly. And it's really tempting not to say I told you so, because we try to help them. We try to keep them from running into the wall. But they say, no, I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to run into the wall. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Dr. Caproni. Sorry, when you talked about non-catastrophic failure, can you expand a little bit? Because a lot of times what we see with parents is being able to identify the big thing when it's drinking and driving, but what if it's the meanness versus the bullying versus the harassment that goes on in a school where kids, like your students were talking about the meanness that they experience. At what level is a parent their children and say, here's how we need to cope with it before either going to administration or going to other parents or making it so that the child reads the parent as now, oh my God, this is terrible, and you know, I've got to save you from this.
Did everybody hear Dr. Kyle? Oh, okay. That's a really hard one because it varies with situation and with the kid. I think, though, the first thing we have to do when these situations come up is to talk with the other parent. Hopefully we have another parent there that we can rely on. And then for both of you to sort of look into yourselves and see what kind of reaction this has engendered in you. When my daughter came home and said she got disinvited from the Disney trip, I was pissed off. I thought that this was unjust. I thought it was rude. I really wanted to take that teacher and shake her, that parent and shake her. So I had to kind of get in touch with my own feelings before I could really understand and empathize what my daughter was going through. So, and then I had to talk to my wife and say, what are we going to do about this? I mean, this is, you know, here the kid's crying, she's all upset. You know, should we do anything? And it took a while for us to discuss it and finally figure out that no, we're going to sit, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to support her, but we're not going to intervene. We're going to let her experience this and learn from a hard knock that sometimes these things happen. Does that make sense? Dr. Kaya?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay.
It's a tough one. I don't certainly have the answer, and that's a good step. But then as a parent, when do you say, okay, now it's happened for 3 days in school, and it's still not resolving itself. We need someone to resolve it.
Yeah, that point, again, I think parents need to really communicate with each other and decide when it's reached that level where we do need to intervene. And sometimes we do. Sometimes we need to go in and do something and talk to administration. Yeah.
So related to Dr. Kai's point, I think one thing that would be interesting to get your perspective of getting out of the children's side of things is when you're on the receiving end of those parents that are like, hey, something happened right away, you get a text, this is happening, why is your kid doing this, how do you deal with that?
It's your kid that's being complained about. Oh, okay.
I'm getting a complaint about my kid.
Good question here, because one of the interventions, well, the question is what happens when, as a parent, you get a complaint from another parent that your kid has done something bad. Okay, is that the gist of it? Okay. That's a pretty difficult one, because you're being asked to kind of intervene, not by your kid, but by somebody from the outside. I had something like this happen with one of my kids when they were in early high school. And the information that I got from the other parent was very disturbing. And it was something that I felt that I needed to do something about. And what I basically did is I thanked the parent for giving me the information. And then I went to my kid and I said, this is the information I've got. What's going on? And I confronted my kid about it, and my kid admitted that what was going on was, in fact, you know, more or less true, and we went from there. So I don't know if that's the exact kind of situation. You're talking more about a relational problem.
What I'm thinking is, again, we parents, some of us think one way, others think another way, right? So I'm more on the side of, hey, let the kids resolve it. That's how it works for me. Let them try to resolve it. Yes, if it gets to a point where it's something really bad, definitely I'll get involved, right? But then you deal with other parents that right away, even if it's something that is not as big, they just make a big fuss.
Okay, the point here being that what happens when the other parent has sort of a different level of catastrophic failure in mind than you do. And that's a tough one. I think we have to, you know, maybe talk with them and say, well, you know, why do you feel this way? I don't feel this way for my kid. This is the way I would recommend you would go about it. I'm not going to jump in with both feet on my kid if I don't think it's necessary. But I will take the information that you've given me, and I'm going to talk with my spouse about it, and we'll act accordingly. Yes?
Which may affect their partnerships with their spouse
Yeah, the question is concerning how the concept of self-esteem plays into this. And I think for many, many years in psychology, we've talked about self-esteem. You couldn't pick up a psychological evaluation that didn't say, this child has poor self-esteem. I think what we've sort of broadened the concept to the idea of resilience, so that self-esteem is one of those components for resilience. But self-esteem doesn't really come from us patting our kid on the back and praising them. What it comes from is feeling competent to meet the challenges that are developmentally appropriate for you at your stage of life. And that's where these guidelines come in. The more we promote resilience and a sense of competency, the greater the person's self-esteem is. And I agree with you, it's a very critical part to our adulthood relationship and those kind of things. Okay. Yes, ma'am? Yeah, if we have another conversation going on, please have some courtesy here and let's prevent it. I don't know if it's coming from another room or what. Okay. I think Dr. Kyle's going to try to figure it out. Appreciate that. All right. Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay. Yes, sir.
So, I'm not sure if anybody else is experiencing this, but sometimes I find the most difficult challenge is when, especially in a divorce household, where the other parent may be very proactively trying to help, maybe overcompensation or whatever it is, but effectively, let me cut that for you, I'll get that, and don't worry about it. And then when it's your time and you're all of a sudden like, you really got to solve this, you can do it, you know, I can give you some help, but you know, I know that this is something you can do. So that becomes sort of friction point. I'm not really sure if there's
What you're bringing up, I think, is a really common situation, and that is particularly, you don't have to be divorced for this to happen either, to be on very different pages in terms of how to intervene and what kind of guidelines that you're comfortable with. But particularly in divorce situations, it can be very difficult when one parent takes one course of action, the other parent takes another course of action. For many years, I've done private practice in Dade County, and I had a family that I worked with for several years after their divorce, and it was a very acrimonious, litigious divorce. There were 2 kids involved, and one of the kids was my client. What amazed me was that the parents were able to come in week after week and try to put aside, not always successfully, try to put aside their disagreements, their dislike, their feelings of anger and resentment, etc., 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 for the purpose of being good parents to their kid. And they really impressed me with that, because they were able pretty effectively to say, that's outside of the office. We're not going to deal with that in here. When we're in here, we're going to just deal with how to get on the same page as much as we can in dealing with this kid and his particular problems. So I think that's the key, is that even though we experience the failure of a marriage, and that's for any of us who've been divorced, I've been divorced, this is pretty heavy stuff to go through in terms of our own person. But when we do that and there are kids involved, we have to put them first. And I think that's the common factor that we have in a divorce, is that those kids are the most important thing. If we can keep that in front of us, then we're good. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes?
I'm divorced as well and have a child from my parents. The challenge with that is that both parents think they're putting the child first with their point of view. So you think that you're doing what's best.
You're including yourself on this, right?
Yes. I have a daughter that's going to be 21. So I lived it. Her dad and I got divorced when we were 3, when she was 3.
Right.
So we've lived this where it is, he has one point of view that he thinks is the best course of action, which is totally contrary to my point of view, which I think is trying to find that common ground, because you're both doing what you feel is best for the child. So it is a very complicated.
And I I think that you point something out real good here. This is again talking about how when both parents in a divorce situation feel they're really advocating for what's best for their kid. Their intention is good. Well, as a therapist, what I would say at this point in time is that there's a wide range of approaches and interventions that can be healthy, that can be good for kids' development. What never is healthy is when there's two different points of view, and that the kid is caught between a conflicting set of rules, guidelines, or expectations. So what I would say to the parents in this situation is that somebody's going to have to give. There's going to have to be some compromise, maybe this way for a particular situation, this way to the other one, because you are not helping your kid when you give them conflicting approaches like that. And that's the hard part, you know. Then both parents have to, again, look into themselves and see what's causing them to be sticking in those particular positions where they don't have the flexibility to compromise. And again, that applies in non-divorce situations too. A lot of times my wife and I have differed in terms of what we think is the right approach in a particular situation. And that's where you got to communicate and talk it out and come to a united front. It might be this way for this situation, more on one side. It might be this way on another one. Okay. Any other comments or questions? All right. I'm thinking that, you know, most of the rest of this presentation talks about this book, which is very good, but I think we've covered a lot of the situations. So I'm going to just go through a summary of that, a couple quotes from the book, and then if there are any other questions, we can take them, and otherwise we can go on and do what we need to do. Okay. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. So, some of the main points that this book makes is, again, as we were saying, painful, non-catastrophic failure is essential to our child's maturation, independence, and resilience. We didn't become the strong, successful, resilient adults that we are through anything but hard knocks and learning from those adversities. Kids develop resilience because they have to. A critical component is the ability to tolerate frustration. And what we're talking about there is not only our kids' ability to tolerate frustration, but our ability to tolerate frustration while our kid is going through that 5 or 10 minute tantrum after he loses a game. So how in our risk-aversive and phobic society do we embrace painful, non-catastrophic failure and optimal frustration for our little ones or not so little ones? And a couple slides here that I particularly like, I'll go through. And that is that we're giving a quote here. I have missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I have lost almost 300 games. On 26 occasions, I have been entrusted to take the game-winning shot, and I have missed. I have failed over and over and over again in my life. And that's precisely why I succeed. This is a quote by Michael Jordan. Anybody old enough to remember Michael Jordan? Okay, good. Another quick one, a quote, I don't measure a man's success by how high he climbs, but how high he bounces after he hits bottom. General George Patton. So again, the rest of it is pretty much going through the book. I do have a few guidelines from the American Psychological Association for raising resilient kids. Would you be interested in those before we wrap up? All right, let me jump ahead to those. I guess I don't have that here. Okay, you can go online to the American Psychological Association website and you'll get their 10 guidelines. They're very much similar to what we've talked about so far. Any other questions or comments before we finish up today? Yes.
You're trying to teach your children how to be resilient. What I got out of this talk was, you're trying to have to let them fail, and that the failure brings the resiliency. But how do you apply this with, I have a teenager who has ADHD, and so has zero executive functions, so organization. So how do you take these principles and how do you apply these principles to children who have different special needs?
Okay, good question. The speaker understands that we need to help our child deal with non-catastrophic failure and learn from it. But what happens if your child has a special need that adversely affects their ability to do that, such as ADHD or another problem? I think this is where attuning to their specific personality is the important part. A kid with ADHD oftentimes is an active kid, and if the kid is active and is involved in sports, for example, you're going to have multiple opportunities to learn how to deal with frustration, losing, failure, criticism of a coach, etc. If your executive functioning is not up to par for your age, it's going to take more of those experiences to stick. It's going to take more of those experiences to reinforce with a parent when you're talking about what happened in that game just now and why I'm so frustrated. So the learning curve is going to be a different shape for a kid that is going to have to experience things more than one time. And that's tough. There's a book out that has an interesting chapter in it, Malcolm Gladwell, David and Goliath. Has anybody read that? Has a chapter in there of a very successful guy. He's made a lot of money. He's executive of a corporation. And someone asked him what was his secret to success. And he says, the fact that I was learning disabled in school. So why do you think he would say something like that? The reason is that I learned, he says, quoting him, I learned that I had to put out 3 times the effort than the guy sitting next to me to learn the same thing. But I learned that when I did that, I could meet that standard. And so I've taken that and used that in my adult life. And I realized that I'm going to work 3 times as hard because I have a learning disability. Does that make sense? That's David and Goliath, and the author is Malcolm Gladwell, the guy that wrote The Tipping Point. Yes?
When it relates to, I guess, the learning, the academic environment, so those same kids that have ADHD, for example, would you allow them to fail more and have those learning experiences more on the athletic side since they're active? You mentioned a lot of those kids are more active, but still give them the supports on the academic side, or are you suggesting that kind of across the board they just...
Well, okay, the question is, how do you fine-tune those experiences for a kid that has a special need like ADHD or another special need?
Fine-tune it, but, like how much should be allowed on the academic side versus the academic?
Yeah, that's a great question in terms of academics versus social-emotional development. And I think that varies with the kid and it varies with their age. There may be a point in time, for example, in middle school, many people are now saying, we need to de-emphasize academics and boost our emphasis on social-emotional learning. Because that's what's most important. That's what's most important moving forward in terms of learning in a variety of situations. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. In my working with middle school kids, you're not going to get a lot out of academics if the social-emotional piece is really way behind where it should be for your age. So that would be kind of a blanket or general answer, but I always come back to saying that this is specific to a specific kid. There's no one-size-fits-all. And it changes. It's a moving target. So our job as parents is really difficult in terms of keeping up with that kid's progress. You know, today, we might need to de-emphasize academics. Tomorrow, it might be a different story. Does that answer your question at all? Okay. All right, yes?
I just was wondering, in your experience, if you have any quick tips or things that we can quickly throw into our minds. Because it sounds like a lot of this really isn't about our kids, it's about us, which I agree. But when you're in the moment, and what is something you can tell yourself or you tell your clients to tell themselves to realize, okay, take a step back, or this is going to be fine, or what are the magic words that we can tell ourselves?
Breathe. Take a breath. Bite your tongue. Before those words come out that really are pushing to come out, take a deep breath. Maybe 2, maybe 3. And really focus on it. This is the same principle we use when somebody pisses us off at work and we want to write a hot email to them. Okay, has anybody ever had that happen? It happened to me like 2 days ago. I was in the middle of writing the hot email, and then I said, no, I haven't breathed. I breathed, I didn't write the email then. I went back an hour later and wrote a cool email. So I think the same thing applies with kids. Yes?
A lot of parents and kids focus on intellectual IQ. However, I read that the emotional IQ is as important or more in dealing with life than the intellectual IQ. What are some things we can do as parents to boost the emotional IQ of our children?
Excellent question. One of the authors here, Goldstein, is the guy who wrote the book on emotional IQ from the article that I first talked about. So the question is, how can we boost the emotional IQ of our kids? I think one of the ways we do it is to have a little less emphasis on IQ itself, on intelligence and academic achievement. It's great when we praise our kids when they do good things, but do we want to give them the message that that's the most important thing in the world? When somebody hires them as a young adult, they're not going to be quite so much interested in the grades they got as to how well they integrate into the particular work situation, whether they can work as a team, whether they can take criticism, whether they can tolerate frustration, learn from experience, and problem solve. Those are all emotional intelligence kind of things. Oftentimes I'm talking to people and I say that IQ is less important than LQ. And LQ is the likability quotient. How many people want to work with somebody that's high maintenance, that doesn't have good interpersonal skills, no matter how high their technical expertise might be? That's a person that can be quite difficult to work with. You know, you want somebody who can integrate well into a situation, that can respond flexibly, okay? So these are the kind of things in terms of our kids. Coming back to your question, I think we de-emphasize a little bit, oh, you're such a smart kid. Oh, you got straight A's. Yeah, we can give credit for that, but let's also talk about how we get along with people. Okay? Yes, sir? I'm sorry. You had a question? Yeah.
I guess it's all well and good that we're having this course to kind of learn this, but is the administration also doing this? Because the idea that the school needs to kind of understand that is just as important as the parents understand it. Because if the school is emphasizing academics over all else, then it's not going to help you if your kid, you know, gets caught up and has those catastrophic failures when the reason for that is that they need help on the others. So is that something you're also working within SocialEmotional?
Absolutely. This gentleman has a very good question. He says, as much as parents might be emphasizing things like emotional intelligence and social emotional skills, are we doing that as a school? And one of the things that I do here and my staff do here is consult with teachers, administrators, and student services counselors on that exact thing. How do we deal with a situation that might look like a discipline situation, but are there aspects to it that some counseling might be appropriate in terms of helping a student learn from some mistakes, as opposed to just imposing, a consequence? Sometimes consequences are therapeutic too, so I'm not posing the idea that it's all one and not the other, but I think that perspective is very strong here in the school. We've been here for the last 6 years as an interdepartmental collaboration with the College of Psychology, and I think the administration has been very open, to those kind of questions and concerns that you address. Yeah. And that certainly is my priority too. That's my role sometimes. And oftentimes I'm brought into a meeting, for that purpose, to see, what are the other aspects that we can look at in addition to what's evident academically or from a discipline standpoint. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes?
Are there any additional resources or skill building things that you can suggest? It seems to me like this approach it calls for a lot of empathetic listening, but the average person, we're trained in reading, writing, and even speaking, but none of us are trained in listening. So even if you take a breath and stop and try to listen, we're not really trained on the level of listening that maybe some of this calls for.
There are a couple of things that I could suggest. One, if you find yourself your own experiences and emotions getting in the way, then some counseling for yourself is a good thing. And a lot of us have been in counseling in this field, and we find it very helpful in order to be able to put those listening skills into place more easily. But beyond that, there's an interesting project out at the University of Arizona called Civil Discourse. The Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona has some interesting guidelines in terms of how people can listen better and talk in a way that is not as aversive and adversarial. If you go online and look at something called Fighting Fair, Rules for Fighting Fair, these are some guidelines that are designed for couples or parents and children in terms of how we can communicate and listen in a little more effective way. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Anybody else know of anything along the lines that this lady saw? Yes?
Well, something that I've found in my almost 21 years of being a parent is that coming to terms with my child is not my expectation of my child. My child is who they are. So how I solve a problem or how I encounter a situation might not be what's best for my child.
Hang on a minute. I want you to repeat that so everybody can hear it. That was too good. I'm not going to summarize.
As being a parent for the last 21 years, I've come to recognize that my child is who they are. They're not who I envisioned them to be, or they're not this one right way. They are who they are, and how I solve a problem might not be what works best for my child. So try to put myself, rather than trying to make them do it my way, put myself, because I'm older, I have more experience, to put myself in their personality and try to give them solutions that might work with their personality as opposed to what might work for me. Coming to terms with the fact that my child was not going to be an A student and that she was going to be a C student, and that was okay. Because that was a very hard thing for me to learn to deal with to accept failure academically as we talk about it. Everybody can't be an A student, but as you hear the old saying says, the C students hire the A students, and they tend to be more successful. So I had to pump myself up with things like that, and it helps me a lot to recognize that each of my 3 children are individuals, and not one of them is who I want them to be. They're who they are.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Caproni, just to add to other resources, as if you don't have the skills, what you can do, if you don't have the skills, I think this is just prime opportunity to jump in. Every division, lower, middle, and upper, have amazing counseling departments. So instead of just jumping and saying, you have to solve this for my child, it's to go and email the counselor and say, I need your help. Or the administrator, and that comes down to some of the other things. If you change, as we said over here, that maybe this is more about us than our kids. I can tell you that in all the years of education, that was right on. If we can step back, if we can't solve it with our children immediately,
Then step back and say, well, what resources, you guys are at university school, my God, we have everything for you here. If you let us be that person for you. So you email the counselor and say, I need your help. Or you email the teacher, I need your help. I am seeing my child isn't doing well on this. Or I'm hearing, or my child is saying in your class, so-and-so is teasing them. Or whether it's to the teacher or the counselor, reach out and change that, and we can give you the skills to work with you behind the scenes as a partner to train you in the way, or we will go right at Dr. Caproni, we got this email. How do we respond to that? Because sometimes we need the help as well. If we work that way and step back and say, there's my child, okay, I want to help you, I can't do it right now. I'm listening, but let me see what I can do. And then reach out to us and say, help. And then let's work together instead of jumping and saying to fix it. So to the resources, that is your number one immediate. Also, if we're recommending books, what we give our teachers is Carol Dweck's Mindset. It's a book I live by as a parent. When I read it as an educator, I stopped and said, you know what? I got the education component, but I didn't have the parent component. And that was really hard for me as well, raising two children, one being a C, and having major learning disabilities, and one being gifted with the anxiety that he cannot cope, and he needs all external motivation, which is great. I got the A, give me the compliment. So I had to work with Dr. Caproni and all the counselors and the teachers and an amazing neurologist to figure out how to step back and ask for the resources that I need, and to go to my child's counselor and say, I'm stepping out, but I need your help, because I can't be the one to do this. So those were just some of the resources I had to jump in and say about it.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle. Any other questions before we wrap up? All right. Yes. No. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and have a good day.